Today what we wanted to do is have a session dealing with the theme of social equity and advocacy, either in planning or design work, as a general theme to start a discussion looking first retrospectively at how those issues have been incorporated into the curriculum of the school, dealt with on an individual basis by some of the faculty in the school, and also in some cases overlooked or underemphasized in various ways throughout the school's history. And based on that retrospective examination, we'd then like to start exploring some ways that the school could be more proactive about pursuing both an inclusive, diverse, and also equity-based mission and activities through the various types of things that we pursue both in our educational curriculum and also in terms of the research mission of the university and the service mission of the different members of the school, whether we're talking about faculty, students, or staff, or some combination of all three of those groups. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming today because this is a very important topic to myself, as well as our panel members, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, but also just judging from some of the faces that I recognize in the room and also others who I saw on the list of attendees, I'm aware that this is also a topic of growing importance to people out in the community. And so hopefully we could start to develop connections and bridges and ways of thinking about these topics, both from the school's perspective, but more importantly from the perspective of how the community can bring the school more into an active role in pursuing various types of equity issues across Buffalo. And so first let me introduce myself. My name is Rob Silverman. I'm a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I also have an affiliation with the Center for Urban Studies as a senior research associate. And I do a lot of work related to fair housing, community development, public engagement, and other areas that naturally kind of fold into the topic of this particular panel. We also have some other members of the panel, which include Professor Henry Taylor, who is the director of the Center for Urban Studies. He's the gentleman sitting right to my right. We have Professor Samina Raja, who is also a faculty member in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. She's also involved with the Food Lab as its kind of founder and principal investigator. And she's involved with the, is it the Global Equity? Community of Global Health Equity, which is one of the newer initiatives that the school's become involved with, which is really an interdisciplinary initiative dealing with a number of issues related to community global health equity. We have Molly Ranahan, who's one of our doctoral students and also works for the Erie County Senior Services, and Jonathan White, who is a research associate with the Idea Center, which deals with a number of inclusive design projects and other issues related to making the work of planners and the work of architects more accessible to a broader cross-section of the population. And so to kind of kick things off, I just want to again point out that one of the main issues that we'd like to engage with today in our discussion is the way that both planners and designers engage with the community and promote equity and also advocate for the betterment of society in general, but particularly of how people interface with the built environment. And what that means is that we both look at the activities of planners and designers from the perspective of who we plan for and who we design for, but also who we plan with and who we design with. And so there's a concept that we, by pursuing equity and pursuing advocacy, we're also opening up the dialogue and creating more interfacing between the different groups that both benefit from plans, that sometimes are left out of the planning process, and also that kind of participate in and contribute to creating a more diverse and inclusive landscape for planning to take place within. And as an outcome, we pursue those types of activities because we're interested in ways that we both distribute and also redistribute goods and resources in society. And so as a goal of planning that's driven by kind of an ethos of equity, we're always thinking about the most fair and equitable distribution of the different resources that go into the planning process. And sometimes that also means a redistribution of the way that we actually produce both goods and services in the built environment, and also, how different social groups participate in them. So with that, because I probably talked more than I should have, I want to turn the mic over to Professor Taylor, and then we'll kind of work our way from left to right down the table, and let each of our participants maybe comment briefly on where they see the school from their perspective in terms of equity and social justice, and what their hopes and aspirations are for the future in terms of those same issues. So it's up to you.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to try to cover several topics within the limited amount of time that I have, as they relate both to the issues of equity and design and the School of Planning, School of Architecture and Planning. I think that the School of Architecture and Planning was born in a very complex time when the urban environment and the urban setting was in a very turbulent place. And our school was also born in a city that was also going through a very, very difficult transition. So I think a combination of those two created an environment as the school was born to create a space to allow planners and architects to pursue, as they define an aggressive agenda, as they begin to frame out who and what the school was. In my own intersection with this school, I had been brought here to build a center that would create, popularize public service on campus, while at the same time creating linkages and services to the larger, linking the university to the larger community. After a period of time, I developed an association with the School of Architecture and Planning, and my center relocated here. There was a fundamental reason why we wanted to be in this particular environment. We talk about the built environment. What that means and the place of planners in there, I think, is extraordinarily unique. A built environment must be designed and then built. It's design. So planners, in every sense of the word, are the architects of that environment. The environment that we built in the United States was deliberately and intentionally designed as an environment that would be class stratified with a racist underlying. And the city building tools were official city planning, zoning laws, building codes, subdivision regulations, and eminent domain. The zoning laws were particularly important because it would be the zoning laws that would enable planners to create urban settings that segregated homeowners from renters, and segregated higher income groups, renters and owners, from lower income groups, and designed in a setting in which, in most instances, the lower income groups would be forced to live in the most underdeveloped and undesirable places within the city. Usually those settings in which housing units were intermingled with factories, commercial and industrial societies, and when owner and renter occupied units would be there. So it meant to me that planners were preeminently positioned to redesign and recreate an urban environment that would produce a different set of outcomes. And so when we relocated in the Center for Urban Studies, not for the urban, in the School of Architecture and Planning, the idea was to acquire and develop and to utilize those skills in order to design, first to understand what is a just city? What does it look like? How is the land use set up? How do we control its operating system computer-wise? And that operating system is a land market that by its very nature flips low to high value uses of land. And anytime you're flipping low to high value uses of land, you will segregate. And this is why I say, show me a place where the urban land market is operating as it is, and I will show you a place that is automatically segregating and pushing low-income groups into the most undesirable locations and places. This is why it was no accident that when we developed the medical campus, that it automatically began to displace the people who live there. So in 1970, in the medical campus area, there were 9,000 black people. Today, there are less than 1,700 in that same location and place. The school gave us the freedom at an individual faculty level to pursue these types of issues and questions. But I would suggest that the school never made those issues in question things that were at the center of what the school was. And by that I mean to say, in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the operations of the departments, and like, I think we were a liberal school, but we were not a school that embraced, at that level, the principles of social justice and equity, not to the same degree, say, for example, as the University of Michigan, or even to the same degree as USC. So I say that so that as we look forward into the future, when we say, what about the next 50 years? And I'll be here for that celebration too. I'm going to be the first one to defeat Father Time and break Methuselah's record, along with Ed there. I think he's halfway on that track now. I'm just joking, bro.
We are taping.
But what I'm saying is that I think at this next level, we need to intentionally make social justice a part of the school's philosophy, a part of our written record, and that we need to think hard about what does that actually mean in terms of the design of the curriculum and the like. I mean, for example, the issues of race and class should be in the middle and the core of what we do. The United States is the most racist and class stratified society on the planet Earth. And we as planners are the one group, more than any other group in the society, have the capacity to design cities and places and fight for the design of cities and places that could shift and change that. But we can't do it if it's not a part of the curriculum, not a part of the values, not a part of the ethos that drives us. And if it's embedded in the curriculum, if it's embedded in the practical activities of what we do, then we will train our students so that they will be in a position to confront these issues in the real world. And I got to tell you, if these kids graduate from the school, folks who've never had large amounts of contacts with blacks and Latinos, and they don't get that in the classroom, in those settings, they will not be prepared to produce the kinds of plans that will transform and change the world as we see it and as we hope and as we want it to be. Thank you.
Samina. Well,
Can we
you're,
cheer?
you're welcome to clap after each speaker.
Okay. So we were given a few questions to think about for our short presentation to you. How much time do I have, Rob?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. So, unlike Henry, I have been here for a relatively short time, and I have no intention of coming back in 50 years. I will be hiking up a mountain. I'm going to begin with a story.
I'll send you a telegram.
Okay. I'll begin with a story that I don't know if Henry knows this, and I haven't publicly shared it, but today is my turn to embarrass him. So I came to UB in 2001, the year of September 11, as many of us remember that time. And I went on the job market for a lark, just to test the waters, actually. I was not done with my dissertation. I hadn't defended. It's not a lesson for you. And came to interview, got an interview, came to interview at the university at Buffalo, and was invited to go out with dinner with this gentleman named Henry Taylor, and had dinner with him and was convinced that this was the job I wanted, because he said during the discussion that if you want to make a difference, come to Buffalo. So that was the school that he represented to me, and believe it or not, that's why I took the job. Now, whether the results are to your liking or not, that's a secondary thing.
Well, I remember we went to the Thai restaurant.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Where you ate and asked me questions, and I remained hungry, and hence, most of my work is on food justice.
I'll accept responsibility for that.
In all seriousness, I could not agree more with Henry about the time in history that we are. Related to that story, I was actually hired at UB to teach statistics, to teach research methods, not to teach about food. I tried to insert food conversation into our first meeting together, but believe it or not, it did not go very far. Anyway, I taught about statistics and research methods for many years, and even then recognized that research methods were often used for the wrong things. And my portion of 10 minutes is really about that. It's that sometimes even when we have the right values as planners and right aspirations as architects, when we execute, when we implement our methods, it's where we fail the people we intend to serve. And first of all, complete agreement that this school has to really make social justice, racial justice part of its core mission. And I would add to that that we also have to recognize that all of the injustices that exist both in our city of Buffalo but globally are quite complicated. They're not a singular injustice. We live, unfortunately, in a world where a single injustice amplifies another injustice, and another, and another. So we see all of those injustices layered, which I think Molly taught me to use the term intersectionality to describe that. But all of those are amplified in one point in space. And that one point in space is what planners or architects engage with. So we have to, A, figure out how we're going to make injustice a core mission of our school, but also to think about that injustice with complexity, and that it changes from year to year. I'm pretty certain in 1950, or I don't actually remember when the school opened, gender was not at top of the conversation at that time. And I'm sorry to say that gender is still not part of the conversation, both in our scholarship and as well as in how we act in planning our cities. But gender is not only it. There are other identities that are not recognized in how we plan our cities. So the question is, how do we actually go about doing it? We cannot do it by not teaching about it, for sure, but we also cannot do it by not paying attention to history. In addition to, so I've already made my one point, which is that it's in the implementation and the execution of our aspirations that we fail the most. But the second point is that we cannot presume that those injustices are static. They change. Therefore, our school's education has to really be embedded in history. You can't talk about racial injustice today without really talking about the history of slavery in the United States. You can't. So without historical context, without understanding the layering of identities, we're not doing a great job. So what are our challenges as a school? Our challenges as a school are that we are not able to really bring the voices of the people we intend to serve among our midst. I think this is what you were alluding to, Henry, that if our students don't engage with communities that they intend to serve, they're not going to be able to do a great job. But I'll take that one step farther. It is not about taking our students into communities. It's about making sure those communities' voices are represented here. We have to do an incredibly serious job of recruiting students and faculty that can represent their own communities in addition to bringing their scholarly perspective to their work. So in other words, scholarship about injustice is great, teaching about injustices is important, but also amplifying the voices of those who we intend to serve by bringing them into universities so that they are vocalizing their concerns. So that's kind of the backdrop of what I think about and I'm concerned about. About this school, I don't have the benefit of history that Henry does. He's been here much longer than I have. I will say that as a faculty member who has been at this school for 15 years, there have been challenges, there have been ups and downs. For those of you who don't know this, but planning is not the most female-friendly profession within the university or outside the university. But our school does try to make an effort to make this a friendly place, but we have a long way to go. So we continue to do a great job, but we have a lot of challenges to overcome. Beginning with making sure that there isn't just one female faculty member sitting here, and of course we have a doctoral student. And we do have more faculty, we do have a lot more female faculty in our school, but we've got to go a long way and have an honest conversation about it. Coming back to what the future holds, I think the future for us is fairly promising because we are willing to engage in an honest conversation right here. So we have somebody who organized this session. We have leadership of the university and school that is engaged in that conversation. And for me personally, it's an exciting time because I don't know how many universities across the United States have explicitly committed their own funding to set up a university-wide center squarely focused on equity. So I think Rob mentioned this, that I'm one of the faculty affiliates of a university-wide center called the Community for Global Health Equity. And Corey, who's sitting here in the audience, is the associate director, and he can answer questions about the center. But to use that as an example to say, this is a public university that invested its public funding to support a research initiative. Actually, it's research, education, and community engagement that is squarely about addressing global health equity. And by global health equity, we don't mean just by doing research somewhere else. It's also about thinking about how that impacts in our own backyard. So for instance, one of the projects that that center is working on has to do with refugee populations. So my 10 minutes are almost wrapping up, so I'm going to conclude by saying it's a serious time. There's some days it's really challenging to wake up in the United States and look at what's going on in neighborhoods. And it's incredibly challenging to be part of a profession that, as Henry really described well, is responsible for creating the injustices in the US. The conclusion, though, is that doesn't mean we sit and not do anything about it. We have the tools and the opportunity to actually make a difference, and I couldn't ask for a better place to do that than at UB with all of you. And you'll see why shortly.
So I've been really fortunate to have equity as a thread through my experience at UB, partly because of the professors that I've worked with and the positions in the classes that I've had. So some of the work that I've been involved with has looked at equity in streetscapes, not only for people using streetscapes, but different modes. Thinking about equity for returning veterans when they're coming back from wartime, and thinking about housing that better serves not only their needs, but the needs of their caregivers and their family. So thinking about complex needs in housing, thinking about built environment barriers for people using paratransit, and thinking about ways to encourage equity as part of development agreements when we're building new things with Dr. Silverman. So being in a school where there are people working on equity-based things, it's really been supportive for my research. And what I hope to offer is thinking about two things: introducing new populations to planners and new audiences for our work. So my research looks at the needs of the LGBT community, specifically the intersecting needs of aging within that community. And then the audience of my work is thinking about nonprofit organizations and government agencies and how they can collaborate to better meet the needs of this community, which is really exciting. So I work now at the Erie County Senior Services, and one exciting thing that I've learned since taking this position is that our New York State Office on Aging has prioritized equity as a thread for the way that they allocate funding to all of our area on agencies. So every county has a department that works on aging. So that's really exciting. So for instance, one grant application that I was just working on was providing funding for Medicaid enrollment and Medicare enrollment. But a piece of that funding, the county had to identify a way that they were going to do outreach meaningfully to an underserved population of older adults. Really exciting. So essentially, Erie County Senior Services works as a planning and advocacy organization for older adults. 3 of our upper level supervisor positions have planning right in their title. They do needs assessments, they develop programs and policies, they implement them, and they track them. So this is a discussion that we should be part of. And they're doing extraordinary things, not only with the LGBT community, but with refugees, older adults living in rural areas, things like that. So my research is really trying to look at how we can find strategies to better recognize these populations of underserved older adults, understand what their needs are and how that intersects with the built environment, how diversity in the built environment influence our program development decisions, and how we can use planning strategies to better reach these populations. And there's an audience for this research. I was just at a conference in Albany where Erie County Senior Services was presenting on a collaboration that they have with the Pride Center, the first in New York State to have a government agency working with an LGBT organization. And all of the other AAA directors wanted to know how they could do it. So it's really exciting to see that we as planners not only have new populations that we need to start thinking about, but new ways we can get involved in our community. So one thing I've learned during my time here is that there really is a system for aging in a county and in a city, and that's another place that we can get involved with our expertise. So how can we help planning students and architecture students really do this in a more formalized way? So for me, my experience was really kind of navigating my own field, finding classes that worked for me, learning from professors that would support my work. But I was also very fortunate to have a familiarity with the university, to have relationships with people, and have a lot of people going up to bat for me. But I think one thing that we could do to make this a little bit easier for students who are interested in addressing equity in their education and in their work are encouraging more community-based research and class opportunities. So really creating intentional ways for people to do that. We also need to teach planning students about different populations. Something they do in the School of Social Work is have elective courses that specifically focus on the needs of older adults, people in the LGBT community, women, refugees. either having classes like this or making those classes available to our students as electives would be another way of, going that extra step. I think as a planning student, something else that I would like would be to learn a little bit more about how to better address public participation and community engagement as part of my education. I know that we do have courses that address that, but it would be great to take that one step further and really have skills to take that out with. Another thing would be to explore new partnerships for classes, research, and student internships within healthcare and human service, which is something that I think would be a great next step. A couple of things would be Evergreen Health Association. The local chapter of hospice has their own research center, Health Foundation, Legal Services for the Elderly. So they're people that really have to address spatial issues as part of their program development, but they don't necessarily have that staff expertise. And so that's a conversation that we can really help to inform. So some of the challenges and opportunities for broadening social justice. So I think I offered a couple of ideas that I would have really liked to see moving forward. Again, it's getting buy-in and support for that, finding relevant classes, whether it's within or outside the department for students. I think it would also be great to have more flexibility in our generalist track for students to really focus on social equity as something, and I know in the architecture department through the inclusive design research group, students are able to do that. I think also, as everyone's talked about, making the case for school-wide value of social equity and diversity is really important. I know as planners, it's very difficult to separate public interests versus diverse interests, but that's a larger issue in our profession. We need to learn about new stakeholder groups and understand the complex experiences within those groups. So as Dr. Raja was talking about, it's not enough to just think about the needs of older adults, but older adults in many communities have many different needs and their caregivers, and that's something that's happening out in practice. And then really developing and teaching inclusive participatory methods of planning through research and education. So one thing through my job as doing research and planning in a professional setting that I'm struggling with is really learning how we can incorporate older adults better in our policy and decision making. And that's one thing that we're pushing ourselves to do. And then cultural competency and planning. Again, I know they're doing that in a lot of other fields, but teaching students how to work with different populations and what their needs would be. Oh, and adding a service or community involvement component to our curriculum would be great too. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jonathan White. I got my bachelor's and master's degree here at UB. And I've been working at the Idea Center in the School of Architecture and Planning for 9 years. 2 of those years was as a graduate student, and I was in the first year of the Inclusive Design Research Group, which I think is one of the successes that the school has in promoting social justice and equity is that we have these concentrations that allow people to focus on these type of issues. And most of the faculty who are in that research group come from the Idea Center, and for those of you who don't know, is Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access. And we practice universal design, and that's a process that enables and empowers a diverse population by improving human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. And our mission is to use research and development projects, as well as our teaching, design services, and publications, to increase the social participation of groups like people with disabilities and the older generation and others who have been marginalized by typical design practices. Advocacy planning is about giving voice to the people who will be users of a design. And equity planning is about making sure that the underrepresented also have a voice so that the built environment works for everybody in reality, and not a utopian vision of how cities and buildings should be designed by people who are on top. And those underrepresented could be people of lower income, minorities, people who are victims of abuse, disaster, or war, people with physical and cognitive abilities that are different from the majority, or due to aging or disability. And those are the exact groups that the Idea Center wants to give a voice to by promoting human-centered design, or universal design, or inclusive design, or whatever you want to call it. those who are marginalized by top-down planning and design with disregard for what the people actually want and need. And the Idea Center has been advocating this since 1984 when the center was founded. As a world leader in universal design, the Idea Center is currently in our 4th 5-year cycle of a Universal Design in the Built Environment grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So that makes it 1999 when that grant started, and it goes through 2020. We're also in our 2nd Accessible Public Transportation grant from them as well, and that started in 2008. So the Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning has been involved in equity and advocacy planning for some time, and as the comments here so far today have said, well, we need to do more, but we're already on the right track. When the school started nearly 50 years ago, as I'm sure you realize I was there for, the term advocacy planning was first coined at that time, and the school was envisioned as an innovator, a leader in promoting systematic and humane processes for addressing technical and social issues. At the time, how many other design schools had social scientists, environmental psychologists on staff? Few to none, but UB did, because UB recognized the value in being a leader on social issues in design. So while planners were calling for equity in planning, UB was one of the few answering that call. And so in a sense, UB was doing the influencing. So perhaps the topic today is not so much how are the imperatives of advocacy and equity planning influencing the development of the school. While they may have been an influence on the school in its founding, that's because its founders saw and recognized a need. And while society may be the thing that drives a mission, the school is what puts that mission into practice and puts bright young minds out into the world to work on the issue. So for me today, the issue goes both ways, not just about how those imperatives are shaping the school, but how the school right here, here's how the school can influence and advance the cause for social equity. And I think the symposium thus far and this session will continue to highlight the school's work in that area. To talk a little bit more about what the Idea Center does, I talked about the Inclusive Design Graduate Research Group. There's courses on diversity in design. We have publications. There's a book, Diversity in Design, that you helped. No, Megan helped. I thought you helped that too. Oh, I guess it was all Megan. Sorry, Megan. And Beth, of course, helped with that. But also the interdisciplinary nature of our work, I think, is important as well. At the Idea Center, we have architects, planners, environmental psychologists, occupational therapists, industrial systems engineers, and more. And I think that's very important to making sure that it's not just one team working on an issue. It's getting everybody together who wants to see advocacy and equity in design. And I think these successes can be built upon by having more interdisciplinary classes, more of this type of specialization, and like was already mentioned by others, making it really the core issue. So some of the opportunities that we have, I think, for universal design is that it's sort of at its precipice right now. It's really gaining a lot of interest. We have some industry partners that are really looking at doing this. We have standards for, we call them innovative solutions for universal design. It's a set of standards similar to, it's modeled after LEED in that buildings who have an eye towards equity and universal design and making the environment work for everybody. And the owners of those places can use these solutions to design an environment that is more welcoming for all people. And go beyond minimum accessibility codes and really look at making things equal for everybody. And those solutions are online now. But there's a lot of interest in those, and one of the challenges that we're having now is limited capacity to be able to handle what's to come. And I worry that there's going to be a lot of interest in this, and the Idea Center's pretty small. There's a couple of us here. but there's going to be people who want us to review their buildings. And LEED really sort of took off for sustainability when that issue was taking off and still is. And we think that this is at the point now where it's just wants to take off, but hasn't quite yet. And another challenge is outreach and getting people to work on this issue with us. And so I think the school has come a long way in promoting social equity and design, and has centers like the Idea Center and like these other centers that are working on the issue and putting people out into the world. But not every school has that. And so they get into the world, and there's not maybe enough of them to have their voice be loud enough to make it a real issue. And so we need to make sure that we send out enough of those people with loud enough voices to be able to make a difference. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the members of our panel for the comments that they made to kind of start this discussion. You're not off the hook yet. You're going to get to talk a lot more. But the whole purpose of this particular session was to begin a dialogue really with the audience and the broader members of the community about what the role of social justice and diversity and equity would be in the future for the school. And one of the things I kind of want to emphasize is, and it was brought up at different times during today's different parts of the program, was that this building, which is kind of the centerpiece of today's celebration, was originally the Buffalo Alms House. And so it's important to remember that this building was created to meet some of the pressing needs of the most disadvantaged members of the community, the poor, the destitute, individuals who are otherwise not cared for by society. And it's really apropos that this is now the home of the School in Architecture and Planning, and we can reflect on how well this building continues to meet those needs into the future. And in many ways, we should always consider this to be the Buffalo Alms House, not just Hayes Hall and the School of Architecture and Planning, and really infuse that mission into the mission of the school, because we lose sight of that sometimes when we celebrate, the new carpeting and the technology, and forget about the initial purpose of the building and what its purpose should be into perpetuity. And so, Ed, were you raising your hand? Okay, well, I was just getting ready to kind of bring you into this conversation, or at least not you specifically. But we do have these microphones in the room, and I think Stephanie was here, and otherwise maybe we can ask Ilham or one of our other doctoral students to kind of distribute those around the room as we ask the audience to contribute to this discussion. But to really kind of get that discussion going, what I'd like to ask each of our panel members is, if there was one pressing question about some of the social justice and equity issues that you identified in your introductory comments for the audience and for the community that you'd like to kind of use as a way to get the discussion going, what would that question be from your perspective and your experience as a member of the school, as a member of the community, as just a member of society and humanity in general?
Well, my question would be, what's on Ed's mind? He wants to talk. I'm curious now.
Well, Corey, you can give him a microphone. And
Well, I said I was very happy.
this is Ed Steinfeld. He's another faculty member in the school.
Yeah. I was very happy that Rob brought up the issue of the history of this building. And I just want to let everybody know that I've been very upset, and I've let the administration know this, that there is no recognition of what this place was, no attempt to permanently recognize what it was, and to have a dialogue about what it was and why it was like it was and what happened. Beyond this, we should know that where in the site of Crosby Hall was the psychiatric facility that was associated with the Alms House, and there's a graveyard where many people are buried who lived in this institution. So this is a very important site in Buffalo when we start thinking about the dispossessed, the marginal, and so forth, the disabled. And One question I have, and I know what my answer it would be to this, but I'm going to ask Henry and Samina as well, and maybe Jonathan and Molly can chime in and see what they think. All of our centers have significant funding, and we have had for a long time. We have sustainable, research activities going on. Without that, would the school be having an inclusive design research group? Would there be an interest in, Samina came here to teach statistics, right? So would you be teaching food security? Would Henry be a member of the faculty? So I just wonder, I don't know how far we really have gotten. I think we have gotten a certain point because of what we have done, and what we've accomplished, and we're all doing good work. So that's, I guess, my question is, how do we get beyond okay, it's great you're here, and thanks for all the millions of dollars you brought.
Well, here's what I want to say in relationship to that. I think in the academy, we've reached a point where both research and grant making are ends within themselves. They are sources of revenue production, and we're not big on the implementation side. Implementation is almost pointless, when in reality, implementation is everything. I mean, take the Global Health Equity Initiative. I think it's fantastic, but why do you have a Global Health Equity Initiative if health is your real focus, and Erie County ranks number 54 in terms of its quality of health? If we were really focused, we would have an Erie County Health Equity Initiative where we're focusing in on those issues. And I'm saying that at the end of the day, our effectiveness as urban planners is determined by the quality of life in the cities in which we live. And so I'm always concerned, because 50 years after planning has been born, I saw what planners did to the fruit belt. I saw what they did. Planners planned that. I see that the plans that the planners have created are displacing folks from all of the centers of opportunity across the city of Buffalo. And this is why I think it is important that who we are as planners must be embedded, deeply embedded, in a real sense of the word, in the vision and in the mission of the school. And that gets reflected across the board. I mean, so when I look at the hires in the school, I'm just not seeing any Black and Latin anywhere in the administration. We haven't interviewed an African American or a Latino in 10 years. 10 years. Let alone hired anybody. You can't hire if you don't interview. And what we call the recruitment of Black and Latin kids is disgraceful. In New York State, there are more African Americans in New York State than in any other state in the country, including North Carolina. And we can't find anybody. So when we talk about embedded in the mission, this is what we mean, where we celebrate things like the heart in these two buildings, because every day the ghost, in a metaphorical way, not metaphysical way, maybe metaphysical, I don't know. You know, I'm an atheist. So I don't understand all of those things, other than there's some things I don't understand and things I don't want to understand. And some folks at Cuban wanted to take me to a Babylon for a session. I said, man, I got enough problems without going into this metaphysical ancient world that I know nothing about. But the point is, there's an old African saying that says, what you do speaks so loudly, I cannot hear, what you say. So if there was no money, I would be doing what I was doing, because I was doing what I was doing before I had money. It's just that money made it possible for me to do what I need to do in a better, more efficient, and more effective way. And I appreciate, and I'm in the school because the school gives space to pursue certain individual things. But at the same time, it's not enough. And that's my point. It's not enough. And I will not be satisfied with the minimal things that they do when I realize it could be so much more. And up to and including small things, man. Like sometimes I wonder if we had an environment where all of our centers could collaborate and work more closely together, how much more powerful that would be. And I think that a school that anchors social justice at its very center would have somebody figuring out, how can we got all these great minds, all these great centers. How can we create a synergy so that the sum is much greater than the individualized parts? Anyway, that's my answer to your question, Ed. Great question.
Agreed. Great question. Difficult one. So since I'm a researcher, I don't know how to answer your question because it would require a counterfactual that I cannot create. So in the absence of hard empirical evidence to answer your question, I'll offer a speculation.
Speculation is good.
Speculation is good, according to Henry. Okay, so like Henry, I had no money to do work on food. There wasn't even a class on food justice. And there was a chair of the department at the time when I went to her and said, I'm thinking of doing this project on food justice on Buffalo's west side, but there's no money. Will you let me do this? And it's going to be a big time sink. And she said, go forth with all the support you need. And that turned out to be a career-changing, game-changing project for me. That was Kate Foster, for those of you who are wondering. I was a new faculty member. Why would she have said, yes, go spend your precious tenure-track time on doing this? So that took a lot of effort and 15 years of work. Maybe people don't know this, but I never got a grant, large grant, for the work I've done with MAP for 15 years. And that has really been the most formative experience for my lab. Of course, subsequently I did, like Henry, I have tried to secure grants to amplify the work that I do. But even if there was no money, I suspect, like Henry, I would do what I do. I don't know about you, but I think you would do what you do.
Let me tell you another story similar to that. So I'm working with Habitat for Humanity.
Yep.
So they're the largest producer of housing, affordable housing in Buffalo, single-family housing. And they are building lots of housing on the east side and west side. They're doing rehabs. The school has raised how many hundreds of thousands of dollars to build the grow house? And it's a great project. Would the school raise money to help Habitat and help us develop a better approach to Habitat's activities? I think that's something we need to think about. Would it get the attention it gets, and would the alumni be as interested in it? The Habitat houses don't look anything like the grow house. And in fact, it's kind of hard to sell our faculty on the idea of working with Habitat, because from an architectural point of view, they don't look like architect kind of designed houses, even though they are actually not, you know, so the point is there's always, for all these kinds of things, to get them to be at a level of attention by all the constituencies of the school, the faculty, the administration, the public, and so on. It's harder because it's not as glamorous. You know, and I think we have to figure out how to get that. To bring
Well, one of the other issues along those same lines, Ed, is that I think there's some huge intellectual challenges that we need to meet in order to transform neighborhoods and communities. An example is the low-income housing problem. How do we improve the quality of many of these housing units? And I think that goes into questions like how do we come up with inexpensive building materials that would allow us to reduce the costs? How do we come up with innovative systems of insulation in a place like Buffalo, New York, that is inexpensive, that will allow us to make many of these houses energy efficient? Because we're not going to build enough new houses to house all of the people who are there. These are scientific problems, and these are the types of problems I think the School of Architecture and planners should be involved in. But if you don't have that social mission, you will be pulled toward the money classes and the problems and the challenges that they face. And so, again, that's a part of the issue. Another huge question is how do we strategically manage the urban land market? We don't want to suppress the entire market, but we need to be able to suppress it in particular ways. Like the idea of mixed income housing is a nice idea, but it will never work unless you have ways of managing the urban land market. And so again, these are intellectual questions. But if we have a mission-driven school, we will find ways to encourage and create the spaces for people to study, you know, the issues that need to be studied. I mean, I think a classic example is Samina's work on food security. Well, what could be more important than that? And that should have been, again, something that's automatically incentivized, like, oh, you want to work on one of the major problems? How can we help? And those are the things that occur when your mission is clear, social justice and equity. And I think that's where we want to try to go with this department, where we in school, where we're utilizing this unbelievable storehouse of talent, an army of students that we all love and rely on to attack real problems right here, right now.
Can I
So
just make a
Let me
quick
just make
We
one
have a
quick
we have
point,
a,
because we have a question over
comment
here.
from one of our alums who works in the housing sector,
Right.
Christine, who works both in Albany as well as with local community organizations here in Buffalo.
Great.
Hello, my name's Christine, and I'm sorry I missed the Henry and Seema speaking. I was
No problem.
carried away in the hall. I feel very strongly about the this topic. That's why I came into this room. And I've been in housing for 10 years. Before that, I was in private practice doing whatever the firm was that I was working for at the time. And part of what I brought out of becoming a student from this university was the relationship between architecture, planning, urban planning, design, and the community, and also traveling through exchange programs and so forth. But one thing regarding housing that I think is a great opportunity to address some of these issues, which I think that maybe I'd just like to throw out ideas there, so hopefully someone latches onto them at some point and uses them to do good. There's great opportunity, I think, in the new changes. Whenever there's a crisis, it's an opportunity, I guess is one way of looking at it. And because of the environmental crises that we have are, and because now we have people in positions of policy which are creating change, such as the new building code, the new energy code, and different sustainable features that are now that will now be required. Everyone is going to need to learn how to build and construct in a different way in order to meet the new code. And this is just one example. So anywhere you have new construction, you have the opportunity for new training opportunities. Everyone has to learn them. So why not take the people who don't have jobs in the urban core and figure out a way to create some training programs. I know that it's happening, actually, in the West Side. Push has been doing this. However, it's the changes in the code are boosting it up, so it's going to happen everywhere, right? So if we could look at ways to implement this kind of training across the board. Buffalo's not the only city that's struggling. I think every city is struggling. I live in the urban core in Albany, so half a block away is, and up, block and a half up the street is the governor's mansion. Half a block down the street is the drug dealing. So we need to look at ways to provide those people options for employment other than what they're doing, and to create a safe environment, a beautiful environment. And I think there's opportunities for training, and with a way of looking at design. I'm sorry, I don't have all my thoughts organized, so I don't think it's coming across really very clearly, but I'll articulate it more clearly another day. But right now, I think that the opportunities there for addressing economic injustice, the urban core issues, food, and integrating the populations such that the places where we live can be beautiful, sustainable, and people can have jobs, and there's enough to go around. And I'll speak later individually to clarify what I just said.
Actually, it was very clear.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I know from firsthand experience that there are a number of community-based groups and local organizations that are, like you mentioned, PUSH, but also on the east side that are starting to look at that very issue of incorporating training and workforce development into some of the new building codes and building standards. And I think that's where the school can play a really vital role in. Oh, it's not on. But that's where the school can play a really vital role in kind of augmenting those efforts and not just getting the word out, but also kind of connecting those community groups with the resources and the knowledge of the university, and then also we can assist in evaluating those efforts and coming up with strategies to kind of strengthen them and improve them. And so some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of really expanding the mission of the school to have a greater dimension dealing with connecting with communities and connecting with activities that really contribute to equity and social justice would really play right into what you were talking about. I know there was another question, so maybe I'll pass it on.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to tie something that Jonathan and Samina said with what Henry was talking about, which was about implementation and a multidisciplinary approach to problem solving. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the validity of a more multidisciplinary approach to problem solving that would yield to results, whether that's in the academy or outside, partnering with groups outside the academy. And then I'd also ask about a more multidisciplinary approach to pedagogy, not just in research, but having students work with students from other schools. And in particular, I think about social work and education, but there are, you can imagine fruitful collaborations with any of the schools or departments.
I think there are a lot of things that are moving in that direction. That criticize the Global Equity Health Initiative,
I'm
of
going to
which,
respond to that, by the way.
yeah, of which I'm a part. But I think that the abilities of we already have some frameworks in place that can begin to connect to theory to practice, and I think a part of this next phase is really building research models in which there are much tighter linkages and connection between research and practice, with feedback loops automatically linked, so that the scholars who are out in the field testing different theories can then feed those theories back into actual practical work that's going on. At the Center for Urban Studies, which I direct, our work is actually centered that way. We'll, in our research activities, build models, and then in those models, we create opportunities to actually implement them in the real world, because it's in the real world, in our profession, then we can see other resistors that you will run into that will keep actually well-designed projects from being implemented in the real world. And if those things can go back to the research lab, then you create something that's different. And it's been that kind of process that have allowed us to identify what we think is the major blocker to the regeneration of neighborhoods. And those are two things in shrinking cities. One is, how do you deal with this privatized low-income rental market where the vast majority of African Americans and Latinos and Latinas live? And secondly, how do you bring back online abandoned houses and vacant land so that they can be integrated with the existing structures that are already in a market in a way that accents that? And we've created, I think, some really good ideas from that feedback. And then we're positioning ourselves to actually create a model where we try those things. So I think we've got that framework in place. It's just at a nascent level, and it's not used with any regularity, and it's not a clear kind of sense of building interrelated networks between theory and practice with well-designed feedback loops betwixt and between them.
I'd like to add something there that the Idea Center does post-occupancy evaluations as part of our work, and I think that's an important part of that feedback loop, to go out and see what was built and then find out what works and what doesn't work, and not just say, this is a great building, we did a good job on it, but see, well, what doesn't work and who doesn't it work for, and really talk to people and find out what that is, and then bring that back in so we can then teach that to our students. So I think that's an important aspect of it as well.
So that's a really good question, Kelly. To be honest with you, I think if we were to look at we wouldn't even recognize a problem, let alone figure out a solution, if we only looked at it from one discipline. So food security, for example, or food insecurity to be more precise, or food injustice that my lab cares about, and there's several people from the food lab here, is not a problem articulated within the field of planning. So forget whether we can get to the solutions. I don't think we can get to the problem if we look at it just from the lens of planning. And Henry may not say this, but my hunch is, speculation, that Henry's view of urban planning and whether it works or not benefits from his having himself a transdisciplinary training and
It's true.
perspective. Is that
Very, very true.
so? I think even the articulation of the problem is not possible from within a discipline. One. The second, your question was, do we have evidence that it can be resolved faster with a multidisciplinary approach? In my judgment, greater shot at success than, I can't say, we've got the perfect solution, but we can inch closer in that fashion. So pretty much all the work the food lab does is in partnership with somebody from another discipline. In fact, I think even in our lab, our students are from public health, from planning. We've had an occasional architect wander in. Geography, math, what am I forgetting, friends? Management. And I don't think about some of the things that students from other disciplines bring or faculty from other disciplines bring. So absolutely yes. And then fortunately for me, I had the good pleasure of working with Corey this past spring, so I learned something about design. And I would say that in our studio that we did in India, we veered towards it was challenging. We had students from public health, medicine, environmental engineering, architecture, planning, in a studio that was trying to figure out how to deal with public health equity. I can't say really that we inched closer to the solution, but really I think we wouldn't have understood the problem if all of those perspectives weren't at the table. Is that fair, Corey?
We have another mic. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Erin. I'm a first-year MUP student at UB, and I work in the food lab. And so I was really struck by something that each of you had said, and so it started with Dr. Taylor talking about how planners design built environments just like architects do. Dr. Raja was talking about engaging people and really understanding where they're coming from in a community, specifically highlighted gender. Molly, your work, you were talking about LGBTQ communities, and then the Idea Center is doing some really exciting work on equity, and it actually just all of a sudden struck me that there's even elements in this building, which we've been talking about as it is reopened today, that maybe aren't as equitable as they could be. And so, for example, there are no unisex bathrooms.
Yep.
I don't know that there are spaces for pregnant or nursing moms to nurse their children.
Correct.
I don't know if there's spaces for students who need to pray it multiple times during the day to have that space and have it be a designated space where they can go for that. So I just wondered, and maybe this is a question for the entire room, and it's not something that I expect we can answer in the 5 minutes that we have left here today, but I'm just wondering, as we think about moving UB forward, how we might actually think about the specific design of our actual building where we're coming to school and learning every day, and how that may not be inclusive as well.
Well,
That's an excellent
question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we did work to include as much as could be influenced by us. As was pointed out this morning, there were 36 architect faculty all voicing their opinion about what had to be done in this building. But we did look to see what we could do. So, for example, the ramps out front of the building, we used to just have the one in the back here. We put the two out front that don't have the big ugly handrails and everything because we figured out the slope and all of that. So there was input into the building, but you're right that it's not as much as it should have been. Questions like the a unisex bathroom or that sort of thing are things that certainly should have been thought of in this building. And I think maybe Ed has a little more insight into that.
I think there's one unisex bathroom.
Is there?
We don't know where it is.
Does anybody know where it is at?
It's on that wing somewhere. I think it's on the third floor. But this goes back to my earlier question. I mean, we should probably address some other topics, but I just want to throw in a note. We tried to be more involved. We weren't involved. Nobody came to us and said, could you help? We were only consulted surreptitiously on the ramp. So although we talk about participation, that goes back to what I was saying before. There's a committee of faculty that are doing all the decisions about furniture and color and things like nursing stuff and all that. And nobody from the Idea Center is on it. Nobody from Samina's shop is on it. Nobody from Henry's shop is on it. It's a group of people who are into design in a different way. It's about aesthetics. And so how do we get beyond, this is our territory, you go and do your stuff about food, and you do your stuff about disability, and do stuff about race and income, and we'll do our stuff about aesthetics, and this is our territory, and this is your territory. That's what's going on, I think. So I think while everybody says they love us here and everything, let's get some, I had to fight really hard to get somebody from the Idea Center represented on the Design Build Committee that is reviewing design build. There are these competitions going on for mailboxes, for these spaces outside, and they didn't have anybody on it from the Idea Center. Were you consulted on the food, on the kitchens and the?
No, I was not, but I have maybe a slightly different perspective than my two colleagues who've been here much longer than me, both Ed and Henry. And may I finish?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were.
So, Aaron, I think you're asking a forward-thinking question, and I want to answer it in a forward-thinking way. I think you are proposing maybe we need to think about continuing to improve our environment. So even though we may express our share of it's not enough, I do want to clarify that yes, it's not enough, but that doesn't mean we can't change it. I think it's really important to engage with the structures that you're present in, whether it requires repeated, I'm going to show up and make my voice be heard, and for students, that vehicle is the GPSA. So don't forget that you can raise these concerns and continue to bring them to the front. And then I also want to share in the spirit of collegiality that there's the policy decision committee that I was not part of, etc. But there's been incredible hard work that has been put into bringing us here. And sometimes when we have these difficult conversations, it can be perceived as meaning that we don't appreciate what we have. And I want to throw out that we have to figure out how to both celebrate and critique at the same time, and that both of those are healthy processes in an academic environment. I think Henry was alluding to that earlier when he said, I appreciate where we are, but it's not enough, right? So all that to say, I will support you in your search for a unisex bathroom, and I am hopeful that we will have composting on site, which we don't, and maybe get rid of the vending machine someday and have real food in this building.
Oh, that would be
And
powerful.
this building, we're always reminded during the construction process and moving forward today that it's a flexible space by design.
Yes.
And so there are openings to
Yeah.
address some of those issues that you raised. And some of those mechanisms that Samina talked about are really good starting points. And we have all these other creative ways to get the word out as well, like the magic markers on the
Yes.
glass. And so we can all get together and talk about how to kind of pursue that.
Yeah.
And so don't think
I
that there
want-
aren't people behind you.
I want to stress one thing as it relates to that question. I'm a firm believer that the systems that you design create certain outputs, and the models that you have create certain outputs. So if you want to change the outcomes, then the model that you're utilizing has to be changed. Like one of my favorite sayings, chickens lay eggs. So a chicken will not lay a brick. I don't care what you do. You can play new music, come up with certain kind of feeds, and cast all kinds of spells. But at the end of the day, the chicken is going to lay eggs, not bricks. If you want bricks, you have to change the model. So at the core of what I have been saying is that the model that we use to build cities, the current model, will automatically produce underdeveloped neighborhoods on the most undesirable lands. That's what it does. It's the chicken laying an egg. The model that we used to construct this building, and that we do a lot of things in this building, will produce certain outcomes. I mean, you can tweak it here and then tweak it there, but it will produce those certain outcomes unless we change the model. Model or systems produce outcomes. You want changes, you must do systemic changes.
Got a food system metaphor
Rob?
there.
Rob, we have a comment. Rob,
I'm looking over
we
here.
have a
Okay,
comment
we have
over here.
another comment here, and we're starting to run out of time, so
So
this
I-
might be our
yeah.
last formal comment.
I'll keep this
One
sort
more.
of brief, but I've
One
been
more.
taking notes as we go here. I'm an architect in private practice in Philadelphia. I'm a graduate of UB, and social justice issues are really all about what I do because I'm an architect who wants to.
And he
pretend-
worked on the Choice
I did.
Neighborhood Project
I
with
ab-
me and
I
did a
absolutely did.
fantastic job.
Thank you. I got tremendous amount of satisfaction out of that. And now we have to get something to come out of that process, and I'm still working on that, as I know you are too. So a couple things occurred to me in hearing about planners 50 years ago creating the cities and the environments that we're now living in that are not just. It occurred to me that that's true, but they didn't do that out of some specific malice that was particular to planners. They did it because the political and economic environment created the environment to direct them to do that. They did it at the direction of the world we live in. And I think that kind of goes to the opportunity and the conundrum here, which is that in an academic environment we can push, and we can push for the new model that doesn't exist yet or that hasn't been defined. But when you get to the private side, the model's still operating on its old, the train's still running down the track. So I think that there's another issue that Professor Sternberg touched on that's a very serious issue with architecture in particular. I don't know if it has a corollary to planning. The form over all other as the most high expression of architecture, over social justice, over inclusiveness, over good technical skill in meeting the needs of your constituencies. I think that this is a beautiful building. I've been in many beautiful buildings. I've even had a chance to work on a few. But I think that there is far too much consideration in architectural training and also in the profession on the beautiful object to the exclusion of other very important critical issues in our world. And I think that if UB, just taking it local now, if UB wants to really differentiate, and I think that's going to be important in the future. There's too many colleges and not enough students in the future. You really want to differentiate. I think you got to drill down into that and continue to do the work on the ground, both globally and locally, of creating more socially equitable and more just places, because there's far too many schools creating formalists. We don't need them. We're going to become, as a profession, irrelevant, because the future is going to be about surviving. It's not going to be about beautiful objects for a couple of curating clients. Those are my thoughts.
I
I listened to this, and I'm going back, because I was old school with John Everhart, and when we started, we said, that's not going to happen. You don't have to have a beautiful building for it to be good architecture.
And I
listened to the thing about the ramp, it's code.
No, it's
At
not.
the end of the day, if you want to change the toilets, and we were just talking about that, all you have to do is change the signs. This is not a big deal. You just change them. You don't need a lot of committees to make those kinds of decisions. If you want to do something, move it.
Well,
Right.
I'm listening to you guys up here, and you can get too academic on this. You have to get a little bit more pragmatic on some of the stuff that you're talking about, and that's how it moves forward. You can study until you're blue in the face. If you don't do something with it, throw it away. It just doesn't work that way.
Great. Just
There
to
was one.
follow up on both of your comments. First of all, the ramp is beyond code. It's a 1 to 20, and then it goes to 1 to 15. But that aside, to follow up, it seems that your comment was a lot about that there are societal problems, really, and all of what's happening is just, a systemic result of, it's an inevitable result of societal problems. This gets back to something that Henry was talking about, is that really the only way to move beyond that is about having a mission driven toward that. And so if the school's mission is, the form or aesthetics are more important then that's going to manifest in certain results. And if the school's mission is about fixing societal problems, then you'll have a different result. And, you know, some of the challenges that the school has in doing that, you know, like was alluded to earlier, was, you know, hiring African Americans. Well, why is that difficult? Well, because there's not enough African American architecture students. Well, why is that happening? Because the public schools, you know, so there's a whole systemic host of issues of why this isn't happening. But if you make your mission focused on an issue where, well, let's seek out and try to make our school the school that is going out and hiring African Americans or hiring people with disabilities, and we go out and we find those students because they're out there. They're just not maybe applying here, but they're out there. And, you know, like I said, I got my start at this school, and I didn't envision myself in the field of inclusive design or universal design, but I got there because I was a student here. And so that's the first step, is getting, how do you get staff working on the issue? You get students working on the issue. How do you get them involved? You get the high schoolers interested in it. Well, how do you get them involved? So it's all part of a broader societal issue that we're seeing the effects of.
We have time for one last comment.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. My name is Lily Ramundos, and I attended architecture school here in the 80s with a bachelor's and a master's. And I love all things beautiful, but I came here because I'm actually very interested in equity. But for me, that means justice, and justice means accessibility to all things for all people. And I think that in planning, there's a place where you have to be influencers of policy. You spoke of zoning, and knowing what's coming in the future with the restricted access to resources like water. There's the world is becoming a desert because of climate change. So I think that when you're talking about what you can do is to look into the future where, you know, right now we may not have the toilets, but you may not have water in a few years. And it's, I think it would be really great to hear in a planning program about how equity means access to all of these things. And it's policy change. Because when you're talking about justice, it's the thing that sort of always precedes any laws being made. So if you keep pounding on the justice component of any of these things, the laws will have to follow. And so I really commend the work. I think that it would be great to go forward to see what the limitations are and then look back and create some programs, as opposed to trying to address, well, you know, I mean, no offense about the toilets. I go into any toilet that's closest to me, but maybe I'm, you know, whatever. I'm a little different that way. But anyway, so, and if you want to use laboratories, I think it used to be that your laboratories were the inner cities because the suburbs were where all the haves went. But that's no longer the case because it's no longer sexy to be in the suburbs. You have to go to the really dense cities, like, I mean, San Francisco, New York, and you really see inequity, and you see it on the same street next to one another. Access to food is huge. It's huge, and it's not a myth. So anyway, I'm going to stop now because I have to go to the bathroom.
So I do want to, could I offer a resource if you're interested in policy, or share information that might be of interest? Do I have time? Corey? Do I have time, Rob?
I'm not the moderator.
Okay. Could you repeat your name for me, please? Lily. So we didn't get time to talk about our individual research, what we actually do. So my lab focuses primarily on using policy as a lever of change. So I care about hunger and food insecurity, but I know we're not going to make a difference unless we change the policy. So we have a resource for anybody interested in food access, a searchable database of policies across the country that is hosted by the school here, in fact, that identifies those policies that serve the two most underserved stakeholders in U.S. food systems. That's low-income urban consumers and rural farmers. So that's available for anybody to take a look at. But I couldn't agree more. Thanks.
We do the same at the Idea Center with
Yes.
policy as well. We're working on the ANSI committees. The next version of ANSI is going to throw some people for a loop. with some of the larger turning diameters. And so we're doing the same thing. As
Well, and that's a great point to kind of end on about the issue about, translating these topics of social justice into policy changes as well. And so we're going to have to end now. We've already gone over our time a bit, but please, mingle in the hallways, and I'm encouraging you to continue this discussion as we kind of close out today. So thank you for coming.